Hi, my name is Cameron Williams. I'm a student at Troy University, and I'm an ASL interpreting student. Um, this is my final project for my Intro to Interpreting class. My topic was about um, the relationship between interpreters and the deaf community. Um, Hope you enjoy. I titled my paper "What Caused the Rift." Since the profession of interpreting began, there has been a love-hate relationship that has existed between the deaf community and those who interpret. This relationship can be accredited to pivotal events throughout history that have led to members of the deaf community to look upon the profession of interpreting with suspicion and hesitance. Several acts of legislation, though geared toward equal access and opportunity for the deaf, have seemingly had a contra effect on their intended purpose and have further progressed deaf oppression. These acts do not solely do not hold sole responsibility for the rift between interpreters and the community. Interpreters, although sometimes unknowingly, find themselves in a position that tends to reinforce oppressive values. The relationship between the deaf community and interpreters has kind of been a love-hate relationship and a spiral relationship since the 1970s. It's kind of hard to talk about because a lot of people, it depends on the deaf person. Should they be, are they members of the community? Are they outside of the community? Where is it? It's a person to person thing. Some deaf people look at interpreters with hesitance and they think they're just people that are trying to invade into their society and, come to their events and do all these things, but they don't really want to be there. And others look at them as friends and allies and supporters and know that they're or believe that they're there to actually, help with the cause. So let's take a brief look at some of the events that help cause this relationship. The role of interpreters. Before the 1970s, interpreting was seen as a responsibility. It wasn't something that people were really paid for. The people that interpreted were usually children of deaf adults, siblings of deaf adults, or family members of deaf adults. It was people who normally interacted with the deaf community and were around them and knew their communication and their culture. Um, Interpreting started off as interpreting as my contribution. Originally, it was seen as a charitable, voluntary work. The people who did it saw it deemed to be their contribution. I found a quote. It says, "We felt it was our obligation, our duty to do it, and if we didn't do it, the deaf person would suffer, and we would feel responsible." This parallel with the deaf collectivist culture, and the collectivist culture is basically I want like all for one and one for all. It's not about we in America here have an individualist culture. It's like every man for himself, but in that culture, they were contributing for the betterment of the group as opposed to their individual needs. Um, the interpreters then were interpreters for the deaf. This started to change later on, soon actually, but at this point in time, they're interpreters for the deaf. It was about communal obligation. When this shift changed, it became more about economic opportunity. Um, Interpreters need to remember that as an interpreter, it's not just a job. I mean, it is a job, but it's not just a job. It's not just about money. You're dealing with people's lives and their well-being, and you need to make sure that you're ensuring dynamic equivalence, not just for the because in dynamic equivalence is when you make sure both parties involved in the communication process are both being equally their messages both being equally relayed, and one person doesn't have any power over the other person. With the creation of RID in 1964, a shift kind of began to take hold. Interpreting for the first time, it started to become seen as a profession. It was no longer about my contribution; it was a profession. Interpreters and the deaf community both started to view interpreters as being independent from the community. This is when, like I said before they were interpreters of the community or service providers of the community. Now they were becoming service providers for the community. Up until the 1970s, the deaf community had the sole responsibility, and it was ownership of deciding who would come into the community and who was not allowed into the community. To be invited into the community, you had to display a sense of competence about sign language, and you also had to prove that you were trustworthy. Trust, I mean, just as it is in every other society, it's a big deal. In the deaf society, you aren't given trust from the beginning. That's something that you have to earn. You have to know a little bit about the culture, and it's not just something that you can come into and expect that you're going to be just invited in, basically. But when this shift changed, it was a loss of power for the deaf community. Up until when sign languages have been started, it was all up to the deaf community. With RID, sometimes, or with the creation of RID, sometimes the deaf community wasn't even involved. They weren't on the panels to deciding who was going to become an interpreter and who wasn't going to become an interpreter. The issue of money, as it always is, became an issue or a problem with interpreters and the deaf community. Since interpreters were now known as professionals, they requested higher wages. This didn't really go over so well with the deaf community. They started to think that maybe interpreters were using interpreting as a way to gain money. It was no longer about contributing to the community. It became more of an individualist value. And not only that, a lot of deaf people were underemployed or unemployed, and they didn't think that it was fair that interpreters had these increasing wages. Something else that kind of bothered the deaf individuals was that they felt that since the interpreters were increasing their wages, the companies that they were in services that they wanted provided for them from any type of service, I would say. They felt that these companies wouldn't want them around because they needed to hire these interpreters, and they thought that that they wouldn't want to pay the interpreter cost. In the 1970s, movement toward accepting ASL as an official language, it took hold. Colleges and universities started to find the ASL finally was accepted into colleges and universities as an official language, and it fit the requirements of an official language. This is a great accomplishment for the deaf community. Just as that happened, there were a lot of misconceptions that MCE, which is Manual Codes of English, it was easier to learn than ASL. So a lot of people wanted to learn MCE, but just because they thought that it would be easier to learn and that it would be easier to go on in hearing society using this. A lot of legislative acts were passed during this era. They were sought to promote the equality and equal access for the deaf community, but most of them, well, maybe not most of them, a lot of them had the contra effect. They did the opposite of what they were made to do. Sometimes interpreters themselves, like I said, unintentionally, they take part in deaf oppression. Oppression is a big issue in the deaf community because the deaf community is an oppressed group. Your presence alone in a situation with a deaf individual and a hearing individual, the deaf person is oppressed. The fact that you're there is oppression. It's not something you can really help, but you're there. An example of this was the Education of All Handicapped Children Act. This upset a lot of people in the deaf community because it created the illusion of equal access, but in actuality, it really wasn't equal access. And interpreters unknowingly were the center of this. They were being used to create the illusion of this equal access. Another form of oppression that an interpreter can put upon a deaf individual is, just not being prepared for a situation, coming into a situation not knowing the material you're talking about, etc., etc. I read this story about, it was a lady who, she was in court, I think, and it was a rape trial, I think, and they were talking, and the rapist said, I wanted to F her. But the interpreter felt uncomfortable saying the F word in court and said, instead of saying the F word, he said, make love. The rapist got off free. It was a complete miscommunication on the part of the interpreter, and the rapist got off free. So your actions do have consequences. In conclusion, it's your job as an interpreter, as a bilingual, bicultural communicator. You're a mediator. Other than the deaf people themselves, you know the community most. You know the culture, you know their interactions. And you need to assist the deaf community and ally with them and help eliminate autism. Thanks.